Welcome back to Hardball. Late today, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul introduced a declaration of war against ISIS because he says President Obama didn't have or doesn't have the authority to wage war by himself. The president disagrees. And late today, I spoke with Senator Paul about war and U.S. foreign policy. But I began with the news that a grand jury up in Staten Island had decided not to indict a New York City police officer in the chokehold death of Eric Garner. Here he is. Joining me now is Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. Senator, you've made a real effort to reach across the aisle in terms of minority support. How do we bridge the gap between white and black at this time when these kind of situations like just broke in New York with the Garner case? How do we do it? How do we get past it?
Well, you know, I think it's hard not to watch that video of him saying, I can't breathe, and not be horrified by it. But I think there's something bigger than just the individual circumstances. Obviously, the individual circumstances are important, but I think it's also important to know that some politician put a tax of $5.85 on a pack of cigarettes. So they've driven cigarettes underground by making them so expensive. But then some politician also had to direct the police to say, hey, we want you arresting people for selling a loose cigarette. And for someone to die over, breaking that law, there really is no excuse for it. But I do blame the politicians. We put our police in a difficult situation with bad laws.
Let me ask you about the large question of our life, which is peace and war. We've had a policy, it seems, for a long time now of going into countries in the Middle East, whether it's Saddam Hussein. We've had 2 wars with Iraq. We had something to do with bringing down Mubarak, something to do with bringing down Gaddafi, something to do even now with bringing down Bashar Assad. Where are you on all that? And how are you different than the people on the left and people like me who think that's all been a mistake?
Well, we might have some area of agreement here. I think one of the true things that you can say about the Middle East is every time we've toppled a secular dictator, chaos has ensued, and really radical Islam has risen, and we are more at danger. America has more danger from these regions after we've toppled secular dictators. And that includes Republican wars, such as the Iraq War, but it also includes Hillary's war in Libya. So really, I think we need to think before we act. And the other thing we need to do is we need to obey the Constitution, which says you don't go to war without the authority of Congress.
You know, the people who are most stridently in support of Israel, and I understand their goal, but I'm talking about people on the very hard, hawkish right. They're always for these wars. And my question to them is, haven't you followed the creation of the Jewish community, the Jewish homeland, and the Jewish state of Israel? It's been founded on cutting deals with the governments around you. It's never been reaching agreement with the street. Why did they ever think this freedom agenda over there, this overtoppling all these governments, was ever going to make Israel more secure? What were they thinking?
I think the point is they weren't really thinking about this, and the unintended consequences have always been somewhat the same here. And I told them a year ago when they wanted to bomb Syria, I said, the unintended consequences of this is that we will be back a year later, maybe fighting against our own weapons. I said, if you supply weapons to those Syrian rebels, that we may well be back there having to fight against our own weapons. And it's absolutely true now. We will, if we have to go back in there, we will be fighting against our own weapons.
Back in the 60s, when I was on college campuses, I was at Holy Cross, Wayne Morse came by to give a speech at Clark University. And Wayne Morse, the liberal senator back then, we got to have declarations of war, like in Vietnam. You got to go back to the Constitution. If we're going to war, we have to declare it. Is that what you're trying to do with ISIS? Is that the principle you're fighting for?
Yeah, this was a big debate for our founding fathers, and has been it's really probably the most important responsibility that any legislator shall ever have, and that's to send a young man or woman into harm's way. And our founding fathers were very clear on this. James Madison wrote that the executive branch is the branch most prone to war. Therefore, we have, with studied care, vested the power of war in the legislature. George Washington was adamant about this. Jefferson was adamant about this. This is not a function that the president can unilaterally weigh in on. President Obama, when he ran for office in 2007, said exactly that. No president should unilaterally go to war. And this is very disappointing, I think, even for some of his supporters, that he seems to abandon what excited people about him.
On another point, you don't seem to fit into it. Well, let me get into the idea. Is it more conservative to be restrained about getting involved in foreign wars, or is it more conservative to be hawkish? I mean, I think there's an issue of brand here in your party.
I think it depends on how you define conservative. Wars are very expensive, but most conservatives think that the primary function, myself included, think that the primary function of the federal government is to defend the country because it's something that the collective has to do. It can't be done individually or by corporations. So the federal government does have a role in defending defending the country. It's a very important role. But I think also defense is different than offense. And so the people who want to be involved in wars all across the globe, and, you know, some of the people who wanted to be involved in Libya this time, a year before, the exact same people in Washington wanted to support Gaddafi. They were there. Remember, WikiLeaks released documents saying that 3 senators were over there and they wanted to give weapons to Gaddafi. Then a year later, they wanted to give weapons to the rebels. So they've been on both sides of all these wars, and I think really have not fully thought through the unintended consequences of always being involved everywhere.
Of course, Hillary Clinton is the person you're talking about there on the Democratic side, and John Kerry and a lot of others. Joe Biden all supported the war in Iraq. And my question, I'm going to run through all of them. Did the United States have a vital interest in going to war with Iraq the first time? Did we have a vital interest the second time? Did we have a vital interest in helping to topple Egypt's government of Mubarak, the military government? Did we have a vital interest in going to war against Libya? Do we have a vital interest today in going against Gaddafi? Against Bashar Assad? Where does this expansion notion that every time somebody that we don't like a little bit, or Israel doesn't like a little bit, we got to go to war with them? Where's that come from? And it's in your party more than the Democratic Party, although it's in both, that mentality.
Not that we're pointing fingers, Chris, but...
Okay, but no, is it true what I said? Is your party more hawkish than the Democrats? Isn't it?
Here, I think what is true is that you look at each one of these situations, the first check and balance is that you don't let a president do it unilaterally. It has to be debated and discussed in Congress. That's your first check and balance. Then you have to discuss the facts. And I think in almost every instance that you mentioned, Saddam Hussein, there's less stability with Hussein gone. Hussein was actually a check and balance against Iran, and there was some stability by pitting one against another or letting them check and balance each other. Gaddafi being gone, it's more dangerous there. Our ambassador was assassinated. The embassy has fled into Tunisia. In Egypt, I think we were worse off for a while and still, in many ways, are not a lot better than we were before. Syria, I tell people this over and over again. I can't find anybody to dispute this on a factual ground. Had we bombed Assad a year ago, ISIS would be in Damascus, and ISIS would be 10 times stronger than they are now had we bombed Assad. Doesn't make Assad a great guy, but Assad is somewhat a counterbalance against ISIS.
I'm remarkably in agreement with you, Senator, so much. That's scary a bit. Anyway, let me ask you this about where you are also going in your own direction, given your party's position. I think you're out there with Senator Gillibrand of New York fighting for an outside check on sexual abuse of military women. Explain.
You know, I think nothing motivates me more than trying to make sure that the law defends the defenseless and defends those who are minorities, not just color of the skin, but could be gender, but also could be a minority because of your ideology, the shade of your ideology. So when I hear about people being violently abused and that they have to report this to their commander, to me, it's kind of like you work for a corporation and you'd have to report being abused to your boss, who may well be a drinking buddy with someone who abused you. Really, it makes more sense to have it outside the chain of command. I don't understand why someone who's been abused would have to report it to someone who may well be a friend of the person who did the abusing. It should be to people who don't know any of the people. The other thing is that accusations can work both ways. If it's a false accusation, do you want people who are impartial and don't know either side to make a judgment, and someone who's trained in family law and trained in disputes like this? Or do you want someone who says, I'm the colonel and I have to make a decision, and I don't know how to make this decision and be impartial? I think most colonels would say, I'd rather not be involved in this. I'd rather let someone in family court deal with this, because there are accusations on both sides, and it's difficult to get through to find justice. But I know it's not fair the way it is. And I meet women. I met a woman last week, and she gave me her picture, and it was her in fatigues and her with her weapon. And she said she loved the military, and she said, well, you see Senator Gillibrand, and it chokes me up just thinking about it. She says, when you see Senator Gillibrand, give her this picture to show her that I'm proud of both me and her for leading the effort on this.
Senator Rand Paul, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thanks, Chris.